John's Jesus is brusque, no nonsense, awe-inspiring, even at times imperious. It's not that Jesus doesn't manifest these characteristics sometimes in the synoptics, but it seems to me, at least in the Gospel of John, they're enhanced or underscored. Jesus is on a mission, and he's impatient with those who can't keep up, who can't get with the program. And he seems to startle everyone he comes into contact with. Consider Nathanael in chapter 1, who goes from skeptic to disciple in record time. Or Nicodemus, who comes to him in the middle of the night and is shocked to hear that he has to be born again, whatever that means. Or that woman at the well in chapter 4, who is really startled that this Jewish man would ask of her, a woman, and someone from a despised people, for a drink of water. And those temple servants a little bit later that are sent to arrest Jesus, but when they get there and they start listening to him, they're kind of stunned, and they come back empty-handed and say, nobody ever talked like this man. When his mother asks him for help with the wine at a wedding, he brushes her off, but then he helps anyway. When his brothers taunt him about going up to the feast, he says he's not going, but then he goes anyway. When he hears news that his friend Lazarus is deathly ill, he doesn't go, and Lazarus dies. When he gets there, the people are perplexed and upset. And people in John are perplexed by Jesus. In fact, in chapter 6, even those closest to him, when he talks about eating his body and drinking his blood, John says they leave off following. All the way through John, there's more to Jesus than meets the eye. There's something underneath the surface. There's something more than the physical and ordinary that occurs. There's another reality that we're supposed to see, something transcendent, something profound, something the people in the gospel consistently fail to see. John's gospel and John's Jesus are both at the same time profoundly earthy, concrete, and profoundly spiritual and transcendent. After all, this is a gospel that begins with, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, this is not to say that Jesus does not demonstrate acts of compassion and generosity in the Gospel of John. Of course he does. Providing wine for that aforementioned wedding. Addressing that marginalized woman of a marginalized people. Healing a sick child. Forgiving a woman caught in the very act of adultery. Healing a man born blind. Some of these stories are among the most vivid and powerful in the entire Jesus tradition, and they've shaped story and thought in Western society to this day. That story in John 9 is a particular favorite of mine. It's an exquisite piece of narrative art. And yet Jesus in the Gospel of John is not exactly warm and fuzzy. As we've seen, he's more awe-inspiring and powerful and startling. And for that matter, you wouldn't want to debate him. He consistently renders all of his interlocutors mute. And I think that's what makes the passage that Terry read to us this morning so striking. When a group of Greeks come to Philip and want access to Jesus, Jesus responds with unusual passion and pathos. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Throughout the gospel, Jesus has said on more than one occasion that it's not yet his time. His time has not come. But now in this final week of his life, he has. It has. And he knows it. All the signs, all the healing, all the miracles, all the power, all of that appears to fade into insignificance. Something is happening here. Jesus is happening. Jesus is changing. Just before this passage in chapter 12 of John, this pivotal passage, at least for me, a passage in which Jesus moves toward his cross and toward even deeper empathy, compassion, and love. And this is the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11. As I noted, he put off going to Lazarus until it was too late. Lazarus was dead. When he gets to Bethany, he finds that he's been in his grave for several days. He finds his sisters in sorrow and confusion. He finds other people wondering about this man who could have healed his friend if he had been there. And we are told at the tomb, simply, Jesus wept. At this point, Jesus is not the powerful miracle worker and preacher. He's not the astute debater and teacher. He's a friend. He weeps. Something in Jesus cracks open. And so he will say, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, unless it cracks open, it remains alone, just one more piece of unproductive grain. But if it's sown in the earth, if it cracks open and sprouts, it produces more grains of wheat. It produces life. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks tells a story of a young American who was studying in Japan. And one day he's riding the train in the middle of the day, and there aren't many people on the train. Some older people and a few young mothers and children scattered throughout the car. At one stop, a man enters the train. He's clearly drunk and belligerent. He begins raging at the people in the car, making threats. The people are terrified. They get up and flee to the back of the car as the man lurches down the aisle. The young American braces himself for a fight. But there's an older Japanese man there that doesn't move. He just sits where he is, quite calmly, and calls out to the man, "Hey, come over here and sit with me." The man looks at him and said, "Why should I talk with you?" "What are you drinking?" the old man asks. "Sake," he says, "not that it's any of your experience." The old man says, "Oh, I love sake. Every evening we warm up a bottle of sake, my wife and I. She's 76 years old, you know. But we warm the sake up, we go out in the backyard, we sit on a bench, we watch the sun go down, and we check on the persimmon tree to see how it's doing. My great-grandfather planted that persimmon tree." As he talks, the man begins to visibly relax. The old man says to him, "I bet you have a wonderful wife." The man begins to weep. "I have no wife. I have no home. I have no job. I'm so ashamed of myself." That's terrible. Tell me about it." At the next stop, the young American gets off, and when he looks back, he sees the drunk with his head in the lap of the old man, and the old man is stroking his hair as he weeps. This has been, we have been told over and over again, a difficult year. And it's no less true for having been said frequently. Like all Americans, we in Minneapolis, St. Paul have struggled with COVID-19, a crisis that's far from over. We've lived through a divisive election and its violent aftermath. We've endured continuing acts of violence against women and African Americans and Jews and transgender people and Asians. Most recently, the tragic murder of Asian women in Atlanta. But for us, for Minneapolis, St. Paul, we've been confronted with our divisions around race and gender and class and power. We've watched the life being squeezed out of George Floyd, and we're now living in the midst of the uncertainty of his killer's trial. Many of us, myself included, enjoying substantial and undoubted privileges, can shield ourselves from the impacts of such equality, can withdraw, if we wish, into indifference. But others feel the sting of this injustice immediately and find it inescapable and maddening. Confronted with pain and sorrow and rage and fear and confusion, we can either withdraw in isolation or find ourselves crippled by fear and rage, or we can break open with empathy, compassion, and love, as Jesus does here in chapter 12, after weeping at the tomb of his friend. His time has come. His time to demonstrate what it meant fully for God, as we heard last week, to love the world, for him to model the character of that love even to the point of death. It's painful to be broken open by love. It's painful to be broken open by empathy, and it's risky. That old man on the train had no clue whether that drunk would listen to him or beat him to a pulp. And yet, the consistent Christian message is that love and empathy are not only worth the risk, they are the only thing that will make any difference. A love that acts and does not simply stand by passively. In his book, The Four Loves, C.S. Lewis recalls some words of St. Augustine reflecting on the death of a dear friend. And he says that it's really better not to develop these profound friendships, not to become close to someone, not to love like that, because it always produces pain. It's better to avoid entanglements. Lewis says that these words were more leftover Stoicism from Augustine's pagan past than they were anything having to do with Christianity. And yet he says this is canny advice. Love anything, even an animal, he says, and your heart will be wounded and possibly broken. To protect yourself from the pains of love, avoid all human entanglements. Wrap yourselves in little hobbies and habits. Keep your heart safe in the casket of indifference. And in that casket, Lewis says, your heart will not break. It will turn to stone. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable. The only place, Lewis concludes, outside of heaven that is safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. Our life here will not be the same. We are moving towards something new, both within our city and our country and within our church. Perhaps we'll be moving with Jesus out of death into life, but only if we let our hearts break with empathy and compassion, only if we take the risk of love. If we are risk averse, if we are afraid, if our hearts are stone, there will be no resurrection for us. But if they break open, there will be life for us and perhaps many others as well. Amen.